So this little slide was really, when I looked at it, I thought a very simple slide. But the lessons on your left-hand side then are applied to those markets. And it's the lessons that we've learnt here that allow us and should allow us to at least begin supplying those markets from a position of very good discipline and very good knowledge. It doesn't mean that the knowledge stops there, because of course we have to be forever changing and meeting it, and meeting those market requirements, which will be different. But let me say, not too different. I do want to talk about the Bega model. a little bit. And look, the reality is the Bega model is all about relationships. And we know that if you position yourself correctly in a relationship, it does deliver the opportunity to identify and create additional value, to do smarter, better things. The discipline at Bega is that we make sure we have really positive relationships with our customers, really positive relationship with our corporate colleagues, really positive relationships, ironically enough, with our competitors. On the basis that if we do that, and we actually sit down and talk about how we can create value with all those people, we will find the value, and we will find a way to find the position in the supply chain that will allow us to be a little better than just a price taker and just accepting that, well, the world turns down, so we turn down with it. Of course, look, sometimes relationships don't turn out the way you might hope. And this slide actually should not stay there very long, because the truth is that while some relationships end up not finding the way to create value, they are not a relationship that those styles of relationships are not something the dairy industry can afford. They're not something we as a company can afford. We actually have to get on with finding the way to create value. So this is a little bit boring, this slide, but it is about Bega Cheese. It is about the fact that what we saw, and this comes straight out of the prospectus when we floated the company, we saw as particular opportunity in particular parts of the business. So we never expected to control the entire supply chain. We never expected that the niche would be the same in each market we worked in. So in Australia, many would know the brand, but they may know that what Bega identified is that in terms of the cutting, packing and processing of cheese, so the value-added part of the cheese supply chain, Bega Cheese is the biggest by the length of the straight. When you walk into a supermarket shelf, regardless of brand, we've not only value-added our own product, we've value-added product from virtually all our competitors, taking a cost out of the supply chain for the end customer, but taking it out not only for ourselves, but for our competitors, recognising that scale was important. That scale, that level of service provision gives us the platform to then use that strength, that intellectual property, to identify new markets where new value can be created. So in Australia, we didn't look to say it is about us competing and tearing apart our competitor, or indeed taking the risk of destroying value. The truth was that what we said is, at this stage of our life, this was back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we need to accept that we'll be a service provider of value-added products, and we need to be so good at it that everybody else will stop doing it. We haven't quite got to everybody else will stop doing it, but we have got very close as we've continued to build scale, and we now, as you walk into a supermarket shelf, you will see Kraft, Perfect Italiano, Bega, many of the retailers' mark products, all different raw material sources, but all packaged and value-added by Bega Cheese. A real example of just straight down the line efficiency, where at the end of the day, the customer says, I actually think this supply chain is working in the most positive and sensible way as it could. Sorry, I should go back. I'll come back to this slide in a second. The reality is, of course, that was in the Australian market. In the international market, we never expected to compete in commodity. We expected to compete in some high-end value-added product. It was why, when Tatura Milk Industries became available, we thought it was a perfect investment for Bega Cheese, as we looked to again find a niche where we could where we could find growth and premium. And Tatura Milk Industries, it was in nutritionals and it was in cream cheese. So the reality is, if you talk about really simple business 101, if you decide that that's the way your business is going to look, what we need to do next is invest. And that's what Bega has done. It does have some of the most modern infrastructure in the country in terms of manufacturing and robotics. It has strategically located sites across the key dairy areas in New South Wales and Victoria. We continue to invest in market in growing our business. So the great lament that I have, quite frankly, when people talk about manufacturing in Australia is that, and agriculture and value adding, is that indeed it represents very poor investment. It represents, across the industry, you cannot find the people that have been willing to invest far enough down the value-added chain, far enough down the supply chain to actually create a differential for themselves. So it leaves a lot of agriculture in that commodity spot, and that is not where Australian agriculture can be into the future. It has to be out of it, and it has to be out of it, ironically enough, through investment. As a small aside, I have to admit that every so often when I'm watching a news bulletin and I hear about the enormous government support and investment in R&D and new product capacities in the car industry, I scratch my head. Because there is no competitive advantage for the car industry in Australia, yet there are hundreds of millions of dollars of government funds heading in to the auto industry, even though every statistic says that it is, I can't use the Australian term, disappearing up its own, you know what the next word is, but the reality is, you have a look at those same funds applied to dairy, where there is a genuine competitive advantage, where there is security of supply chain, you would see an enormous difference made. Agriculture in Australia, manufacturing in Australia is crying out for value-added investment further down the line. The Bega Cheese business model actually proves it and is demonstrable. It was interesting, Ian's commentary. It's amazing how quickly things go out of date. Bega Cheese now employs over 1,500 people, the vast majority of them in northern Victoria, or not the vast majority, but a very large amount of them in northern Victoria, while manufacturers have been running away from northern Victoria. We have been running towards it as we've built and built infrastructure and made sure that we've put the best quality technology and IP into it. So what's all that resulted in? Well, as Ian said, $1 billion worth of sales, $500 million worth of consolidated assets. A very strong growing business, which is why we wanted to structure that business and take it to the market. It's resulted in this business having a very strong position in the Australian domestic market as both a direct seller, but also as a contract manufacturer for some of the biggest global companies that you can name. But it's also resulted in us having platforms to find growth and value in the international marketplace. So when the theme is and was, how do we compete in the global marketplace? Well, we have to make sure that we have the right platform to enter that. So when we need to make sure we've actually picked where we want to be. So for us, dairy nutritionals, infant formula, growing up milk powders, etc., are a vital part of our business, and this is why. So these are some of the statistics that I referred to in my opening comments. 50% of it is on our doorstep. 50% of the global market is on our doorstep. Western Europe, the US, very similar in size, considered very mature markets with very low growth rates. Southeast Asia, China, extraordinary growth in those markets, an extraordinary opportunity. Hence, strong investment in that part of the business. Why? Well, I think you've all heard this, so I won't dwell on it too long. Increasing middle class and births in the Southeast Asia and North Asia region. Increasing purchasing power of women. So this is around dairy nutritionals and infant formula. There are some enormous statistics out there about who actually buys this. It is probably no surprise, but it is worth mentioning that the buying power of the female population has resulted in an enormous amount of emphasis on products like infant formula, which is why you're seeing enormous growth. There is a recognition of the increased importance of nutrition and indeed the wish, if you like, to be competitive on what children are delivered in terms of nutritional products in the Asian region. And of course, one that is not talked about often, but is there and is emerging, is that a longer lifespan across the world is seeing the other end of the spectrum on dairy nutritionals come into play. So for the geriatric market and the ageing market, there is a need for high-end nutrition that will ensure that they can remain as healthy as possible in their latter years. And when we have a look at the consumption of infant formula in a different way, we can see that it is very strongly related to GDP, but we can see that there is enormous growth opportunity in particularly China and Indonesia. The sector since 2005 has grown at 15% per annum, with the fastest growing sector being China at 23% and Indonesia at 18%. So we've got enormous growth in a very specialised and specific product around nutritionals. And it's why, again, we need to stay, while of course there will always be some linkage to commodity, this becomes a very specialised product with a very specialised customer looking for you to deliver it to them in a consistent way. And perhaps this is another way of showing it, that the reality is you can see that by volume in terms of percentage growth, you can see there Japan, still a very high volume, but not a lot of growth as we see a mature market, but markets like China, enormous growth and enormous volume, and there lies the opportunity that we've identified and when we'll look to continue to service. And I'll talk a little bit about how we might service that a little later. If we have a look at something like cream cheese, Bega Cheese has just announced another $8 million investment and will invest a little more beyond that in our northern Victorian facilities to upgrade our cream cheese supply. And all of that is actually going into, vast majority of that is going into Japan and South Korea, not so much North Korea, but South Korea. And what that's showing again is that while those markets might be seen as mature and maybe not even necessarily the ones that you're expecting to perform, create the right supply chain. This is going in generally as an ingredient for further value adding. Create the right supply chain, create the right reliance. Guess what? You create a little bit of a premium over the marketplace, which I think is where, as I said, Australian agriculture needs to sit.